There's a very specific moment before a real turning point happens, and almost no one recognizes when they're in it. It's not visible, it doesn't come with a warning, it doesn't arrive as a clear opportunity. On the contrary, it appears as a strange feeling that most people try to quickly correct or ignore, but that's exactly where the mistake lies. If you leave now, the tendency is for you to interpret this state in the usual way and revert to the same pattern that is no longer working. But if you stay until the end, you will understand precisely what is happening inside you. And most importantly, why this is not confusion, not a delay, and not a blockage. It is a real transition point that completely changes the direction of your life when you know how to recognize it. Now think about it with complete honesty. At what point did you begin to realize that you can no longer think like you used to, feel like you used to, react like you used to? There's an attempt to repeat the old pattern, but something just doesn't hold up. You even try to fit in, try to keep up the pace, try to stay the same, but the internal response no longer keeps up. This starts to create a feeling of disconnection, and not from the whole world, but from what previously seemed normal to you. Conversations that once flowed easily now seem superficial. Environments that were once neutral begin to feel unsettling. Simple decisions start to require a different kind of attention, because the automatic response no longer works. And here's the point that almost nobody understands. This isn't a loss of capability. This is a loss of identification with an old standard. There comes a point when the mind begins to interrupt anything that is no longer aligned with its next phase. And when that happens, it slows down. However, this slowdown is often interpreted as doubt, insecurity, or a lack of clarity. But in practice, it is a reorganization mechanism. The autopilot starts to fail because it no longer serves its purpose. That repetitive sequence of thoughts begins to lose its power. You start to notice things that previously simply happened without you realizing it. Your reactions become visible. Your patterns are exposed. And that creates discomfort because now you see it. But this discomfort isn't a problem. It's a direct sign that misalignment is being revealed. What you were holding on to without realizing it is now appearing clearly. And when it appears, it can no longer be ignored. It's no longer possible to pretend that everything is alright while resistance exists inside. It is at this point that something important begins to happen silently. Your consciousness begins to take up space. You don't yet have all the answers, but you begin to realize that you can choose. And this completely changes the internal dynamic. Your focus begins to shift. Before, it was stuck in repetition. Now it starts to seek direction. It's not forced positive thinking. It's a natural redirection of attention. You begin to notice where you put your energy. Small choices start to have a real impact. There is more presence in what you think, what you feel, and what you decide. And when there is presence, there is conscious construction. Before this structure stabilizes, there's a phase that many people misinterpret. Emotions become more intense. You may feel more doubt, more sensitivity, more discomfort. But this doesn't mean you're getting worse. It means your internal system is being adjusted. What is out of alignment begins to weigh more than before. What you used to tolerate starts to bother you. And at the same time, what is aligned begins to generate a different feeling. Lighter, more coherent, even if still subtle. Your body perceives it before your logic can explain it. If you observe carefully, you begin to identify a very clear pattern. The discomfort doesn't appear by chance. It points the way. The lightness doesn't appear by chance either. It confirms it. From this point on, an even deeper change begins. You start wanting things differently, but not impulsively or anxiously. It's a silent change, almost too internal to be explained to others. What was once doubt begins to lose ground. The maybe begins to weaken, and in its place emerges an internal decision that doesn't depend on external validation. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to convince anyone. You simply know that you no longer accept going back to the previous standard. And when that internal decision forms, your energy begins to reorganize itself around it. The outside world is starting to respond to this. Situations that once seemed fixed begin to change naturally. Some lose ground. Others cease to make sense. People, environments, and contexts begin to adjust without you having to force them. At the same time, new ideas begin to emerge. New possibilities begin to appear, not as something magical, but as a direct consequence of a new internal positioning. You stop supporting what is not aligned, and that creates space. And when this internal alignment begins to strengthen, your way of acting changes. Decisions cease to be burdensome. You no longer need to expend so much energy to choose. There is a clearer sense of direction. Procrastination decreases not because you forced yourself, but because now there is coherence between what you feel and what you do. Action ceases to be a constant effort and becomes a natural continuation of one's internal state. At this point, another important change occurs. The need to control everything begins to diminish. You still care about the outcome, but you no longer try to force every step. A more stable confidence emerges, based on the perception that a process is happening. Even if you don't see everything yet, you start to allow it, and allowing it completely changes how you receive it. Before, without realizing it, you were blocking things. You doubted, resisted, tried to control every detail. Now there is more openness, and this openness is what allows the new cycle to truly take hold. Over time, this state begins to stabilize. You start to recognize when you're out of alignment and are able to return to it more quickly. The fluctuations decrease because you understand what's happening within you. And then comes the most important realization of all. The turning point you were waiting for was never an external event that happens all at once. It is an internal state that begins silently, almost imperceptibly, and then reorganizes your entire reality from within. Now answer honestly. Do you still believe you're lost, or are you beginning to realize you're exactly at the point where everything starts to change? If this made sense to you, write "I'm in transition" in the comments and keep following along, because there are other signs you haven't yet identified that explain exactly what you're going through right now. So stay with me even more attentively, because what you've noticed so far is only the initial part of a much more precise process than it seems. It's not random. It's not overly emotional. It's not something out of control. There's an internal logic at play, and when you understand that logic, you stop sabotaging yourself precisely at the point where most people give up. Once this internal shift begins, the first thing that truly changes isn't the world around you. It's your focus. But this change is too subtle for those who aren't paying attention. Before, your mind was automatically drawn to problems, repetitions, old memories, and future worries. It was a conditioned pattern. Now, even if only for brief moments, you begin to perceive possibilities. It's not forced positive thinking. It's a natural diversion of attention. And this is far more powerful than it seems, because everything you nurture with attention begins to take shape within your mind. What you observe repeatedly becomes stronger. What you fail to nourish loses strength. So when your focus starts to shift from the problem to the possibility, even if in an unstable way, you are already changing the direction of your own internal system. However, there is a critical detail here that needs to be made clear. This change does not happen in a linear fashion. You don't simply move from an old state to a new one without fluctuating. There's an adjustment period, and it's precisely during this period that most people think they're failing. You have moments of clarity, where everything seems to make sense. Soon after, it seems like you're reverting to the old pattern. Repetitive thoughts reappear, doubts arise, and the feeling of being lost tries to return. But this is not a step backward. This is pattern overlap. The old still exists because it has been repeated for a long time. The new is being built, and for a period, the two coexist. This coexistence creates an internal conflict that seems confusing, but is actually an extremely clear sign that something new has already begun. There's a part of you that wants to return to the familiar, because the brain seeks security in what is familiar. And there's another part that has already realized that the familiar no longer works. This tension is not a problem. It is the process. And the more you understand this, the less you'll be scared by the fluctuations. Now comes a point that separates those who progress from those who get stuck at this stage. The way you interpret what you feel. If you interpret discomfort as a mistake, you try to run away from it. And by running away, you revert to the old pattern. But if you understand that discomfort is a sign of misalignment being exposed, you begin to use it as guidance. And that completely changes the game, because your emotional system isn't working against you. It's pointing you in the right direction. What weighs you down shows what's out of alignment. What brings lightness shows what's closer to your new internal structure. And when you start to observe this consciously, you accelerate the adjustment process. What used to take you weeks to notice, you now identify quickly. You don't waste so much time on patterns that no longer make sense. There's more clarity, even if there isn't complete stability yet. And along with this growing clarity, something even more important is beginning to solidify. Your intention is no longer superficial. Before, you wanted change. You wanted results. You wanted something different to happen. But that was still at the level of desire. Now it's starting to become an internal decision. Internal decision making doesn't depend on motivation. It doesn't depend on external validation. It doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. She simply settles in. You start to realize that you no longer accept certain standards. You no longer accept certain ways of thinking, reacting, or positioning yourself. It's not an external revolt. It's an internal realignment. And when that decision is formed, your energy begins to reorganize itself around it. This is not theory. This is mental functioning. Your brain starts filtering differently. Your attention selects different things. Your behavior begins to adjust without you needing to force every detail. And the external world responds to that. Situations that once seemed fixed begin to shift. Some cease to make sense and dissolve naturally. Others emerge as new possibilities. People enter and leave your circle without excessive effort. And this may seem like a coincidence to those who are not paying attention. But it's not a coincidence. It's consistency. Consistency between what you stopped supporting and what you started to internally embrace. Now pay attention to this, because this is one of the most important points in this whole process. Your behavior begins to change without you having to force yourself all the time. Previously, taking action required effort, rigid discipline, and a constant attempt to push oneself. Now, when there is internal alignment, action begins to emerge more naturally. You make decisions with greater precision, not because you have all the answers, but because there is less internal noise. You don't get bogged down in over-analysis. There's a clearer sense of direction. Procrastination begins to decrease organically. Not because you suddenly became extremely disciplined, but because now there is consistency between what you feel, what you think, and what you do. And when there is coherence, the movement flows. Action ceases to be a burden and becomes continuity. And it is at this point that another profound transformation takes place. The need to control everything begins to weaken. Before, you tried to anticipate every step, predict every outcome, and avoid any uncertainty. This generated anxiety, tension, and blockage. Now, you're beginning to understand that there's a process happening that doesn't depend solely on your conscious control. This doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become aligned. You do what needs to be done, but without the constant need to force the result. There's a more stable confidence based on the perception that you're on the right track, even without seeing everything. And that confidence completely changes your relationship with the process. You start to allow it. Allow things to organize themselves without constantly interfering out of fear. Allow the new to enter without constant resistance. Allow what no longer makes sense to leave without excessive attachment. And this permission is what opens up real space. Because before, even without realizing it, you were blocking it. You doubted, resisted, tried to control every detail. Now there is openness. And when there is openness, the new doesn't need to force its way in. It simply finds space. Over time, this state begins to stabilize. You begin to recognize your own patterns more easily. You quickly notice when you're out of alignment and can return to it more quickly. Fluctuations decrease because you understand how things work internally. There is more awareness, more presence, and more control over one's own state. And this is where most people have an insight that changes everything. The turning point you've been waiting for isn't a one-time event happening outside of your home. It's an internal process that gradually solidifies until it becomes your new normal. It begins silently, almost invisibly, and grows stronger through your choices, your attention, your intentions, and your actions. And when that state stabilizes, your external reality inevitably begins to reflect it. Not because something magical happened, but because you stopped being the same person who upheld the old pattern. Now I want you to be honest with yourself. Do you still believe you're stuck? Or can you already see that you're right in the middle of a process that's reorganizing you for the next level of your life? If this made sense on any level, write, "I'm ready for the next level," and keep following along. Because what you're experiencing now still has deeper layers that you'll only understand when you start observing with the right level of awareness. And if you've stayed this far, then you're no longer operating at the same level of perception as when you started. This isn't motivation, it's a realization. There's a kind of clarity that only appears when a person traverses inner layers that most avoid, and you have traversed them. Now, what begins is no longer about understanding the process. It's about sustaining awareness at a level where there is no longer a comfortable return to the old pattern. There comes a point where you could go back to acting like you did before, but you would no longer be able to ignore what you're doing, and that completely changes the experience. Before, you unconsciously repeated patterns. Now, if you try to repeat them, you feel the misalignment in real time, and that creates a different kind of discomfort. More precise, more direct, almost like a constant alert. This means you've entered a phase where ignoring the problem has become more difficult than changing it. And that is extremely significant. Because most people only change when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing. In your case, that point is approaching or has already begun. Now pay close attention. There's a level in this process where you begin to realize it's no longer about correcting isolated thoughts or adjusting specific behaviors. It's about reorganizing how you position yourself in relation to your own reality. You begin to notice that it's not just big actions that define your trajectory. It's invisible patterns, repeated daily, that shape the final result. The way you wake up and direct your attention. The way you react to something that doesn't go as expected. The way you talk to yourself when no one is listening. These details cease to be insignificant. They become crucial. And when you begin to perceive this clearly, something changes in your level of internal responsibility. Not a responsibility that weighs you down, but a responsibility that guides you. You stop outsourcing control of your experience. And that is both liberating and challenging at the same time. Liberating because you understand that you can change. Challenging because you understand that it depends on you to sustain it. And sustaining something isn't about perfection. It's about consistency. You don't need to be right all the time. But you need to quickly return to the path when you realize you've gone off track. That quick return is what keeps the process alive. And here's a key difference between those who truly drive change and those who do. The ability to observe oneself without sabotaging oneself. Because when you make a mistake, the old pattern tries to use it against you. It tries to transform a small deviation into a complete return to the previous state. But when there is awareness, you stop it. You notice, adjust, and move on. No unnecessary drama. Without reinforcing the mistake, without turning a moment into an identity. And that speeds things up much more than trying to be perfect. Now there's an even deeper layer happening at the same time. Your perception of time begins to change. Previously, you wanted quick results to validate whether you were on the right track. Now, you're beginning to understand that there's an internal maturation period that can't be accelerated without creating instability. You begin to realize that what is being built is not superficial. It's structural. And everything that is structural takes a specific amount of time to consolidate. This requires conscious patience. Not passive patience, Kian, but active patience, where you keep making adjustments, keep observing, keep sustaining, even without immediate evidence. And this strengthens something very important. Your confidence no longer depends on external factors. It begins to be built internally. And when that happens, you stop fluctuating so much based on what's happening outside. You don't lose your balance as easily. You don't become completely disorganized because of a momentary outcome. There is more stability, and this stability is what allows the next level to open up. Because when you remain stable for long enough, reality can no longer ignore this new pattern. She needs to adjust. And this adjustment is starting to appear in ways that didn't happen before. You start noticing synchronicities more frequently, situations that fit together better, decisions that lead to more coherent paths, people who appear at the right time or who cease to have a negative impact. But there's a point here that requires maturity to be understood. Not all external change comes as something comfortable. Some changes come as endings. Things you thought would continue cease to make sense. Structures you considered secure begin to crumble. Paths that seemed certain begin to be redirected. And this can create confusion if you don't understand the process, because it seems like a loss, but often it's alignment. It's reality removing what no longer corresponds to what you're internally holding on to. And if you try to hold back out of fear, you create resistance. If you observe consciously, you understand the movement. And that requires trust once again. Not blind trust, but a confidence based on what you've already realized so far. You've already seen that it has changed. Have you ever felt like you no longer fit into your old ways? Have you noticed that your focus is different now? So why doubt now? This is the kind of question that rearranges your mind. Now comes one of the most crucial points of all, identity. As long as you still see yourself as someone who is trying to change, you create instability, because trying implies the constant possibility of failure. But when you begin to recognize yourself as someone who has already changed, even if the process is still ongoing, you create a different kind of positioning. You don't try to act differently. You act in accordance with who you have already decided to be, and that changes everything. Because identity underpins behavior. Repeated behavior reinforces reality. So when you adjust identity, you change the foundation of everything. And this doesn't happen through empty statements. It happens through repeated decisions that confirm to your brain who you are now. Each aligned choice reinforces this new identity. Each quick return when you deviate from the alignment strengthens that construct. And over time, this ceases to be something you need to remember. It becomes something that you are. And when it gets to that point, the turnaround is no longer an ongoing process. It has already happened internally. The outsider is just observing. Now I want you to stop for a moment and answer with complete honesty. Do you still see yourself as someone who is trying to change? Or are you already able to recognize yourself as someone who is becoming impossible to revert to the old pattern? If this resonated with you on a deeper level, write, "I'm not coming back," because this isn't just a comment. It's a reinforcement of your own internal decision. And it continues here, because there is one final understanding that completely closes all of this. And when you access that, you stop oscillating altogether and enter a state where evolution ceases to be an attempt and becomes a permanent direction. Now pay even closer attention to me, because what happens from this point on is where almost everyone gets lost without realizing it, even after having come so far. You've already gone through the most invisible part of the process. You've realized you no longer fit the old pattern. You've already begun to adjust the way you think, feel, and act. You've understood that something unusual is happening inside you. But now you're entering a phase where change begins to put pressure on the outside world. And that completely changes the game. Up until now, everything was internal. It was perception, discomfort, adjustment, awareness. Now, what you sustain begins to generate an impact outside. And this impact doesn't come in an organized way. It comes as a break from the norm. Things that seem certain begin to lose stability. Predictable situations start to shift. People begin to act differently towards you, sometimes without a clear explanation. Environments that were once neutral begin to seem out of sync. And here's the critical point. If you don't understand what's happening, you interpret it as a mistake. But it's not a mistake. That's the answer. Reality can't stay the same when you consistently change. But it doesn't adjust comfortably first. It needs to undo what doesn't fit before rearranging what makes sense. This means that before things improve, it may seem like things are getting messy. And it is precisely at this moment that most people back down, because it tries to hold on to what no longer fits. It tries to salvage patterns that have already lost their sustainability, trying to organize something that actually needs to be reorganized in a different way. Now you understand this with crystal clarity. Not everything that leaves your life is a loss. Not everything that's causing problems is a blockage. Not everything that seems strange is wrong. Many of these things are necessary adjustments so that the new can truly take hold. And if you try to stop that, you create resistance. And resistance slows everything down. Now we come to an even deeper point. When you approach a new level, the old pattern doesn't disappear immediately. He makes one last attempt to hold on, but this attempt doesn't come as a given. It comes disguised as logic. You start having thoughts that seem rational, but which, at their core, are defense mechanisms of the old pattern. You think you're being cautious, when in reality, you're downsizing your position. You think you're being realistic, when in reality, you're just reverting to the familiar. You think you're taking it slow, when in reality, you're avoiding embracing the new. And this is extremely subtle, because it makes sense on the surface, but it stalls at the bottom. This is the point where the decision needs to be made consciously. You can no longer act solely based on what seems comfortable or logical in the short term. You need to act based on what you have already perceived as true internally. And that requires firmness. Not a rigid firmness, but a silent firmness. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, but you need to stop negotiating with things you already know are no longer useful. And here's an important turning point. You don't need to have all the answers to keep moving forward. You just need to avoid going back to what you've already overcome. This keeps the process moving. Now observe what begins to happen when you sustain this. Even with uncertainty, you continue. Even without complete clarity, you don't back down. Even with discomfort, you don't become completely disorganized. And that creates stability. And this stability is what allows reality to begin to respond more clearly. Things are starting to fall into place little by little, not all at once, but enough for you to get a sense of direction. Decisions are starting to become simpler. Paths are starting to become more visible. What was once uncertain is beginning to take shape. And that happens because you sustained the process when you weren't yet comfortable. There is now a detailed plan that will determine whether this will become a reality or not. The way you deal with uncertainty. If you turn uncertainty into fear, you freeze. If you transform uncertainty into space, you evolve. Because uncertainty, at this level, is not a lack of direction. It opens the way. You are moving away from operating within a limited framework and entering a level where the possibilities are not yet fully defined. And that requires trust, not blind trust, but a confidence based on what you've already realized. You've already seen that it has changed. Have you ever felt that you no longer fit into your old routine? Have you noticed that your focus isn't the same anymore? So why doubt now? This question needs to be clear in your mind. Now comes perhaps the most crucial point of all. Your attitude towards discomfort. If you keep trying to eliminate all discomfort, you will regress. Because real growth always generates a level of tension. But if you understand that this discomfort is a sign of expansion, you use that as an indicator. And this completely changes how you go through this phase. You stop fighting the process, and he begins to cross consciously, and that speeds everything up. Now observe the level you've already reached. You don't react like you used to. They no longer think exactly the same way. It no longer accepts any standard simply to maintain apparent stability. There is a level of consciousness that never returns to its starting point. And that means the change is already happening. Even if it's not yet completely finished on the outside, it's already active internally. And when something changes at that level, there is no real return, there is only delay if you retreat. Now the decision is very clear. Will you maintain this new position even with uncertainty? Or will you use the discomfort as justification to revert to the old one? because it is precisely this decision that determines whether your turnaround is consolidated or whether you prolong a cycle that could have already ended. If this resonated with you directly, right, I stand by it until the end, because it internally reinforces what you've already started. And it continues, because the next step isn't about changing more. It's about stabilizing in a way that doesn't fluctuate like before, and transforms this into something permanent. Now you reach a point that almost no one recognizes when they arrive. Because it doesn't draw attention, it doesn't have high emotional intensity, and it doesn't seem like a major change. But in practice, this is where everything is defined. Up to this point, you've understood, adjusted, sustained, and navigated uncomfortable phases. There has been conflict, doubt, and repositioning. But now the process changes in nature. It ceases to be visible and begins to become structural. This means that change no longer depends on specific moments. It begins to appear in your basic functioning, in the way you think effortlessly, in the way you react without needing to control yourself, in the way you decide without constantly experiencing internal conflict. And that's a very clear sign. The new standard is no longer being created, it is beginning to take hold. But there is a silent risk here. When the discomfort subsides, the mind interprets it as it's already resolved. And it's at this point that many people lose consistency. Not because they want to go back, but because they relax before complete stabilization. And this relaxation is not obvious. It happens in detail. You start allowing yourself small returns to the old pattern, thinking it's okay. You begin to ignore subtle signs of misalignment because they now seem less intense. You start to decrease your presence because you no longer feel the need to be there. And this, if repeated, reactivates the old. Therefore, this stage requires a different kind of approach. It's not a constant effort, it's light but continuous surveillance. You no longer need to fight against yourself, but you need to remain aware of what you are supporting. Because it is precisely this continuity that transforms something functional into something permanent. Now observe what begins to happen when you maintain this consistency. What previously required active attention begins to happen on its own. More aligned thoughts emerge without you having to force them. Your emotional responses become more balanced. External situations cease to have the same impact on you. And that's not because the world changed first. It's because you've stabilized your way of responding. And when the response changes consistently, the external impact changes along with it. Now comes a very important point. You begin to anticipate misalignments before they escalate. Before, you only realized it after you were already involved. Now, you realize it at the beginning. Sometimes just by the feeling, sometimes by the start of a thought, sometimes by the way something touches you internally. And that gives you an advantage, because you adjust early. And adjusting early requires less energy. This reduces wear and tear, reduces drop cycles, and speeds up stabilization. And here begins a very important transition. You move from a state of correction and enter a state of conscious maintenance. It's no longer about putting out internal fires. It's about not letting them start. And that completely changes the quality of your experience. Now you have more energy available. Energy that was previously spent on internal conflict, on doubt, on trying to get back on track. That energy is now being redirected towards building, and construction is on another level. You start thinking about what you want to create, not just what you want to avoid. You begin to act with clearer intention. You start directing your attention to what you want to strengthen. And this changes the direction of your life in a practical way. Now comes a detail that few people notice. When you achieve internal stability, the external world begins to respond more accurately, not only with changes but with coherence. The opportunities that arise make more sense. The connections are more aligned. Decisions lead to more consistent paths. And this doesn't happen by chance. This happens because there is less internal noise interfering. You are no longer making decisions based on fear, impulse, or repetition. You are deciding from a more stable state, and this improves the quality of the choices, and better choices accumulated generate different results. Now pay attention to this point. You begin to trust yourself in a practical way. It's not confidence based on motivation. It's a confidence based on internal evidence. You've seen that you can adapt. You've realized that you can bounce back when you're off track. You've felt that you no longer depend on perfect circumstances to stay aligned. And that creates security. Not that illusory security of total control, but functional security. You know you can handle it. And this drastically reduces anxiety. Now comes one of the most important points of this stage. You begin to recognize yourself in a different way. Before, you saw yourself as someone trying to change. Now you start to see yourself as someone who no longer functions in the old way. And this change of identity is what consolidates everything. Because when identity changes, behavior follows. You no longer need to force yourself to act differently. You act according to who you already know yourself to be. And that eliminates a large part of the effort. Now observe clearly. You don't react like you used to. It no longer enters the same cycles with the same intensity. He no longer accepts certain things without questioning them. It's not anymore that we lose track for so long when something goes wrong. This is not the beginning. This is already consolidation in progress. But there's still one last adjustment to be made: continuity. You can't treat this as something that already happened. You need to treat it as something that is becoming permanent, and that requires consistency, not extreme intensity, silent constancy. You keep watching, continue adjusting as needed. He continues to uphold what he has already perceived as being in line with the established order. And this, over time, eliminates the fluctuation. Now comes the final point of this stage. There comes a point when you no longer need to think so much about staying aligned. You simply are. You don't need to remember all the time. You don't need to correct yourself all the time. You operate according to the new standard. And when that happens, the turnaround is no longer an ongoing process. It already happened. The outside world is just there to accompany you. Now answer me with complete clarity. Are you willing to sustain this silent consistency until it becomes automatic? Or are you still waiting for an external sign to validate what is already happening within you? If this made sense on a deeper level, write, "I hold until it stabilizes," because that reinforces exactly where you are right now. And it continues, because there's one last level that's not about maintaining. It's about expanding without losing that alignment you've built. Now you enter the final level, which almost no one can explain, but which defines whether everything you've built becomes something permanent or just a passing phase. Because up to this point you have learned to perceive, adjust, sustain, and stabilize. You have moved beyond autopilot, faced internal conflict, navigated external disorganization, and begun to maintain a more aligned state with consistency. But there is a point beyond stability, and that's the point where you stop holding back and start expanding without losing your center. This sounds simple, but it's not. Because while you were focused on adjusting, your attention was turned inward. Now naturally, your energy begins to open outward. You start thinking about growing, creating, advancing, conquering things that previously didn't even seem possible or accessible. You begin to see bigger paths, bolder decisions, broader movements. And here lies a risk that almost no one realizes. When expansion begins, a person may lose alignment by trying to accelerate. She leaves a stable state and returns to a reactive state, but now with new objectives, and that breaks the flow. Therefore, this level requires something very specific. You need to grow without abandoning the state that brought you here. It's not about going back to the effort. It's not about becoming anxious about the outcome. It's not about trying to control everything again. It's about moving forward while maintaining the same internal foundation. Now you understand this in depth. The problem was never wanting more. The problem has always been wanting more from a misaligned state. Now you have a foundation. Then growth ceases to be a source of desperation and becomes a consequence. You don't need to run, you need to stay on course. And that completely changes the quality of your expansion. Now you're not trying to prove anything anymore. You're expressing what has already been organized within you. And when you act from that place, everything changes. Decisions become clearer. You no longer choose on impulse, nor out of fear, nor out of need. You choose based on consistency, and that makes each movement more powerful. Now comes an essential detail. You begin to realize that not every opportunity needs to be accepted. Before, any chance seemed valid. Now you filter. If you're not aligned, you don't get in. And this prevents wear and tear, because growth without alignment leads to regression. But growth with alignment generates sustainable expansion. And that's the point most people never reach, because it requires saying no to what doesn't make sense, even when it seems good on the surface. Now observe what begins to happen when you maintain this posture. You grow without losing yourself. Move forward without becoming disorganized. Build without entering into internal conflict. And that creates a completely different kind of progress. It's not that unstable progress that goes up and down. It's continuous progress. Slower at times, faster at other times, but constant. Consistency triumphs over disorganized intensity. Now we come to an even deeper point. You begin to trust your own pace. You don't compare yourself to others as much anymore. He no longer feels that urgency to be on the same schedule as everyone else. You understand that your process has its own pace, and that gives you freedom because you stop pressuring yourself with external references that don't make sense for your current situation. And this freedom keeps its alignment intact. Now there is something growing stronger within you. Clarity. You start to understand what makes sense and what doesn't more quickly. You no longer need to overanalyze everything. There is a more accurate internal reading. And this clarity reduces error, not because you never make mistakes, but because you make fewer mistakes with the same pattern. And this accelerates growth. Now observe the level you have reached. You're no longer trying to leave a place. You've already left. You're no longer trying to find yourself. You've already begun to recognize yourself. You're not trying to change anymore. You're already operating differently. And that means the turnaround didn't just happen. It became established. Now, what you do from here on out determines how far this goes. Because expansion has no fixed limit, but it requires maintenance of the base. If you maintain alignment, you grow. If you lose alignment, you wobble. Simple as that. Now I want you to be honest with yourself. Are you ready to grow while remaining who you've become? Or will you grow too fast and risk losing yourself again? Because this choice defines the next level of your life. If this made sense, write, I grow with awareness, because it reinforces exactly where you are right now, and it continues. Because from here on out, it's no longer about turning the tables. It's about how far you decide to take this new version you've built. Now you've reached the end point, and it doesn't feel like the end. There's no feeling of explosive accomplishment. There's no specific moment where everything is resolved at once. There's no clear line separating before and after. And that's exactly why almost no one notices when they arrive here. Because the final level isn't about doing something new. It's about becoming something that no longer requires effort to remain that way. Up to this point, you have needed to observe, adjust, sustain, choose consciously, avoid old patterns, maintain alignment even with uncertainty, and grow without losing yourself. Now this is starting to cease being an active process and is becoming a matter of operation. You no longer need to remember all the time. You no longer need to monitor yourself as much as before. You no longer need to fight against thoughts as often. Because what used to require effort has now become the norm, and that changes everything. Now pay attention to what this point really means. You did not lose consciousness. You incorporated it. There is a huge difference between being aware of something and being that way naturally. Before, you had to stop and think. Now you can respond differently without needing to pause. First, you needed to correct yourself. Now you can no longer easily access what used to throw you off balance. Previously, you had to force yourself to maintain alignment. Now the misalignment is what starts to become an immediate problem. And that's the consolidated turnaround. Not because everything is perfect, but why don't you support what no longer makes sense? And this is irreversible at a deep level. Now there's a point that ties it all together. You stop trusting the process and start trusting yourself within the process. This is another level. Because the process can vary, circumstances change, scenarios change, but you remain. You know how to come back. You know how to adjust. You know how to reposition yourself. And this eliminates the fear of losing everything, because you understand that you no longer depend on a fragile state. You've built a foundation. Now consider how this impacts your life in a practical way. You don't react with the same intensity. You don't fall into repetitive cycles as easily. You don't stay lost for so long when something goes off track. You don't accept just anything to maintain comfort. You don't need constant validation. You don't depend on motivation to continue. You work, and functioning at this level means real consistency. Now comes the most important point of all. You no longer need to search for a turning point. You became the turning point, and that completely changes the way you see everything. You're not expecting something to happen. You are supporting something that is already happening, and that eliminates anxiety. Because that feeling of when is it going to arrive no longer exists. It has already begun, and it continues. Now there is only one thing that keeps this alive: a clear conscience, no heavy surveillance, not excessive control, natural consciousness. You notice when something starts to go off track and you adjust it, no drama, without guilt, no exaggeration, and that's what keeps the state going. Now observe the difference in those who arrive here. This person doesn't talk that much. She doesn't try to explain everything. She doesn't need to prove anything. She simply lives according to what she has become. And this is reflected in everything. In the choices, in relationships, in the decisions, in the way she deals with challenges, in the way it is built, and most importantly, in the way that it's no longer lost like it used to be. This does not mean there is no difficulty at all. It means the absence of prolonged disorganization. And that is what defines true stability. Now I'm going to leave you with a question that isn't about beginnings. It's about continuity. Are you going to treat this as a moment that has passed? Or are you going to acknowledge that this is who you've become and continue living from this level? If this made sense on a deep level, write, "I am already that version," because this is not an empty statement. It's recognition. And if you followed along this far, like and subscribe, because what you've accessed isn't common. And keeping this active depends on continuing to nurture this level of awareness.